probably hasn't been a lot of action against it, that people are trying to, they want to know how to comply. And so it's helpful to get something down where people will know what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, I get that. I think, you know,
Yeah.
the joke in the financial aid
Yeah.
community is like, be careful what guide Dave
Right.
publishes all the time. Like, be careful what you ask for in terms of guidance from the department, because once it's out there, then you have to live with it, right? So I'm just trying to understand what the
Well,
actual need is.
yeah.
I mean, and I know a lot of us have been talking about these topics
Well, I
for a
also
long
had something-
time, so I get it.
Sure. And I also had something come up to a NASFA meeting where they were being reviewed, and that they felt that they were going to be hit on it too, and so they were going to get it. So we don't want to get too many more of those. If they're
Yeah,
gonna
so that's
be
what I was
done.
trying to get a
So,
sense
yeah.
of, like, the number,
Okay.
the end size.
And then, David, to the question that you had before about when students get support when they need, and trying to put some language in that, I would highly support that. Again, I said before that everything that's ever come out about this is not about regular and substantive interaction. It's regular and substantive instruction. Everything is from interaction to me. I don't know, if we go back to the dictionary, they were saying before, is a two-way street. Everything that's ever been defined on this has been set by the instructor, set by the institution, put out by the institution on their schedule, those sort of things. And it seems like it's time, especially with CBE, that we have something where there's the ability for the student to have some role in that. And again, I know we get close to being towards correspondence, but I think there are ways with immediacy of response and the expectation for that and other such sort of things where that could be part of this definition, where it's not always based upon once per week as done by the instructor or the institution.
David.
So I just want to make sure I appreciate the concerns about subject matter experts and the conversation that we've been having, and I agree that those people need to be on the teams, but I really don't want to lose the teams. I think that is a huge advantage or huge improvement over the previous language. And you know, at my previous institution, we understood the previous language. We didn't like it, and so we came back to the department repeatedly trying to get a different interpretation, because it really was a problem for the model that we were trying to use. And we weren't trying to teach students poorly. We were trying to adopt a model much more akin to modern healthcare than traditional higher ed, where you do have teams who provide care in ways that the patient actually needs it at a given time, rather than always having to see the doctor. And same idea with the team approach to instruction. So I just want to make sure we don't lose that, because I think that is a big improvement.
Jessica.
Two things. One, to the point that, or to the extent that you answered Jillian's question referring to specific program reviews, could you please share those documents with us? Second, I just think that under the HEA, we're stuck with regular and substantive interaction with the instructor. And I hear your point about instructional teams, but I don't, if we're setting a minimum floor and that minimum floor is set by the HEA and the HEA says it's regular and substantive interaction with the instructor, I don't understand how we're talking about giving Title IV funds to programs that don't actually have as a minimum regular and substantive interaction with the instructor. And it's really just a question.
All right. So I think it's Meredith.
Yeah, I have a couple points. Boy, I hope we don't go away from Team 2. I think we're supposed to be moving the needle as much as we can in these negotiations to try and bring it up to speed. So I hope we don't. I hope we don't push that some. And I think we can have the subject matter expert built within that team, whether they all have to sit in the exact same person or not. I want to say, one, to get to Jillian's comment, I think the last high-profile case had a chilling effect on a whole lot of folks who are looking at this. So I think a whole lot of us just shut down. And I speak for a lot of my peers in that, to say who the heck is going to take that chance until we find out exactly from the Department of Ed, and we ended up with a little bit, I think, of a back and forth with the football. Is it the accreditor who's going to set it, or is it Department of Ed who is going to set it? And I think in some cases the accreditors weren't going to take that chance and then found out the institution got hit and have them come back to their accreditor. So it definitely had a chilling effect, I think, on innovation in that way. As I listen to some of these comments, one of the things we've known about online is that you can capture far more data than you ever can in a traditional educational setting. So accreditation teams do not come in and say, let me see everybody's test. And so let me then see, did the faculty member write, nice job, nice job, nice job, nice job on everybody's test. So I'm okay with setting the floor. I think we need to set the floor in some ways. I think we need to be careful that we don't overregulate disproportionately high in online in ways that we could never measure. You know, in some ways we're assuming that the faculty member has no, that the faculty member or that instructional team have no ethics and they have no ability to monitor themselves in the same way we believe they do in a traditional setting. And so I just want to caution us, let's set floors that are safety guards, but I caution us against trying to over-regulate one industry so far outside of the way we would over-regulate traditional higher ed, when in fact you can't even go in oftentimes in a faculty member's classroom to monitor based on the different various agreements they have.
Aaliyah.
Thinking about this from the perspective of a national accreditor, where I read program reviews from all the case teams, so I can see that there are variances in how this has been applied in program reviews, and I've seen the impact that has had on institutions. I kind of like this language because I think it has some nice parallels to standards accreditors are required to have by the recognition criteria. And since we're talking a great deal about instructional teams and how much meaning that can have for a student learning experience, and what I mean by that is a practitioner that has a lot of really good hands-on experience, but maybe not the PhD, and the PhD who has been immersed in scholarship and in teaching and learning, but really hasn't been in that field. When you can put that together as an instructional team, it becomes a very powerful experience for the student. What's not maybe in the recognition criteria for accreditation is, you know, the idea of instructional team. And so maybe this is something we kick to the big committee and say, can you look at maybe some criteria around instructional teams, that the accreditor has standards that say there's appropriate supervision, academic credentials, practical experience, all of these things if you're using a team approach at an institution. Maybe that could solve some of our questions that we're having about the quality of instruction, the level of expertise being given to the student, and then the whole continuum of learning. And then maybe we can get to benchmarking, you know, as that measure. So that's what I wanted to offer.
Denise, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out from the department's perspective, we're looking, this, I guess the changes weren't just reactionary, they are partly that, but also trying to look forward and contemplate some kind of a base so that whatever comes in the future that we can't contemplate right now, that we're preparing for that, so that we want to set that up as well. Jessica, in terms of an instructor, because the statute doesn't define instructor, I do think we have some leeway legally to come up with our interpretation in terms of defining it. And as somebody that's been dealing with administrative law for years, as we said, when you have a statute that was written before a lot of the modalities and ever-evolving education arena that we have now, we've got to try to gauge our interpretation and without being completely strict to instructor means Webster's definition of instructor, because we would be stuck. And I think we understand your concerns from the student perspective, and as I said, I'm an enforcement attorney in the office, so I certainly look at things and how do we enforce this and how do we protect the taxpayers and the students. But I think we have to have some flexibility in terms of interpreting it and implementing the words of the statute. And since it's not defined, I don't think we're violating the strict language of the statute to interpret instructor to be a little broader than what one would normally have thought of as an instructor or faculty.
Sure. Jessica wants to respond.
Sure, absolutely. And in the example that Leah said, I would understand that that classroom would have 2 instructors, not none. I guess I'm just trying to imagine the world in which the regular and substantive interaction is provided by someone who could not fall under a definition of the instructor we could all agree on. And I don't understand why that's the world that we're looking for. That's where my confusion is falling, is not that a course could potentially have more than one incredibly qualified instructor, but that someone could go through a program without interacting with an instructor. And maybe it's just I'm not up on the sort of modes that people are pushing.
Go ahead, Lee.
I mean, any accreditor that does their work would never allow that. I mean, that just, when you go in and you look at distance ed quality, I mean, you are looking at the management system. You are looking at what kinds of assessment activities have taken place. Has there been some meaningful, customized engagement between the qualified instructor and the student? And it can't just be an email exchange. Thanks for turning that assignment in. It really has to show that there has been some individualized attention to that student. And there's other ways, through automated learning management systems that, there can be, automated tests and quizzes along the way, but, true instruction that we're awarding credit for really has to demonstrate that there has been that kind of interaction between the faculty and student. And I believe accreditors, on balance, are doing a good job of that.
Denise?
No, and I was just going to say, Jessica, I think the department's well aware of the concerns about balancing the two issues in terms of the innovation and the teams, but also understanding that the students are paying for, and the department in the loans and the Pell Grant are paying for the student to get instruction and to get the subject matter and all of that. So I think the department, when they're coming up with the language, is very conscious of those two competing things. So I don't want you to think that the innovation is going to outweigh that piece of it.
Okay.
So first of all, I want to say I'm really appreciative of the discussion that we've already had so far. This is really helpful for us, and I want to continue. I'm not going to stop it. But there is something that I want to talk quickly about and maybe get a temperature check from the room about this. So as I mentioned before, one of the big things that we're grappling with is whether we should have this whole idea of distance ed defined by the accreditor or whether the department should do it. But I think I want to talk about something a little bit more narrow. It sounds like a lot of the folks around the table are agreed that the accrediting agency should define instructor or instructional team, or should have something to do with making that part of the definition. And if that's true, then I think it would help us move toward kind of putting the parameters around that we need in order to provide a proposal to the larger group. So I was wondering if my colleagues are okay with it, if we could do a temperature check on that part of it, about whether the accrediting agency should be the entity that defines instructor or instructional team for these purposes. Again, without any discussion of parameters or what the accrediting agency needs to consider or anything, just so that we can kind of keep that in mind and have it be one of the things that we're thinking about. Because the reason I bring it up is because the department is in a very difficult position if we try to define that, and if we can, because we do not make academic decisions, and if we tried to define something like that in statute, it would make it we'd be perilously close to running outside of our purview. So in the interest of trying to narrow our discussion just a tiny bit, I was wondering if I could get a temperature check around the room of whether people are supportive of the accreditor defining instructor or instructional team, or at least who the person is or who the people are that are doing this.
I think we could do that. I'm sorry. Someone have a comment before we do that?
Just as long as we could, in that language, open it up that it could include instructional teams.
So this is, again, this is including instructional teams. Yeah, and we haven't gotten that far yet, but so either of those.
Okay. So before we discuss that, I just don't want to, Sue, I haven't ignored you. I didn't know if you had something substantive to add to that discussion before we ask.
Well, I do. I wanted to go back to a point that we have two Davids down here, but David Musser, the point that he made, let's be careful that we don't make this so restrictive. And again, I want to enter medical education into this because I love the line that says the institution's accrediting agency determine who the qualified instructor or member of the instructional team. If we're sending students out on a clinical rotation, year 3 and year 4, that is an instructional team. And our accreditors, whether it's COCA or whichever group is overseeing that medical team, they understand that. And so I really appreciated your previous point when you said, let's make sure we don't make it so restrictive, because distance education, as defined by many of the states, is when we send our students across state lines. And I know that's an unintended consequence, but this is an opportunity for us to fix it. And so then that's when they are applying, and Russ, you know it well, some of the fees and rates for us to be able to deliver that education if we don't have a physical presence is the trigger. So very much appreciated your previous comment and that language.
Okay, so the other plackets that are currently up, are they reflective of what David last said? Okay, so I think Jody was first.
My comment was just a quick response to Leah's comment about how the accreditor would never let that happen, where you would never. I understand that, and I generally think that absolutely the evaluation of accreditation the evaluation of academic quality and all the things that go into it should be up to the accreditor. I just wanted to raise the issue that every once in a while we do have bad actors in the field, and so I do understand why some people want potentially would like some guardrails. I don't know how to do this balance. I think this is a very discussion is very reflective of the difficulty between fostering innovation and tolerating risk. And I think this is one of the areas where we're really seeing it.
Jillian.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate that I wouldn't be comfortable with that proposal unless we incorporate sort of what Leah's suggesting in terms of then I think either if it's this group or the full committee needs to have a robust conversation about how to, I mean, we're just sort of kicking the issue to a different time, which is fine. I mean, I get the department doesn't want to play in the space and I think it makes sense, but we then need to provide the right guardrails so that we understand what we're expecting of our accreditors. And I think, again, I'm not worried about Leah or any of the existing accreditors that I know of, but this in concert with the proposals being made by the department that would essentially allow me to be an accreditor, an accrediting agency, as long as I accredit one school, really creates the conditions where somebody could take advantage of this sort of flexibility if it's not well defined.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that that with this is without any discussion of potential guardrails, but accepting that could be part of the final solution. That may be a bad phrase, but could be part of the solution that everyone is able to agree on. So this is just really, should the accreditor be the one that makes that decision, and we'll have to decide how many guardrails are around that decision. So that's what I'm asking for in the room. I know that some of you may have sideways thumbs, assuming that you want other things to be part of it. But I just want to get an understanding of where people are on that point.
Jody,
I think it's important to point out. I think it's important to point out that we're not precluding those guidelines, and we're not precluding teams, nor are we precluding some guidelines on those instructional teams, such as who has to be on those instructional teams. So all of that's open. Just as David said, we're just making this, taking this temperature based on whether this should be an accreditation agency determination. So we're not precluding.
So given the discussion we just had, Greg, maybe we take a temperature one more time here, because I think that we've had a little extra layering of discussion, and maybe we have convinced someone to not go sideways.
Let's give it a try. We'll try. The thing about the thumbs is, as a child, I watched so many swords and sandals movies that every time I think of the thumbs, I'm picturing myself in the middle of the Colosseum about ready to have it ended in front of the emperor. But that said, we'll do the thumbs. Thumbs up means you're wholeheartedly in agreement. Thumbs to the side, you can live with it. Thumbs down, you cannot live with it. So go ahead, show of thumbs. Just as David, restate, David.
One more time. So you are agreeing, maybe agreeing or not agreeing with the idea that the accrediting agency would be the ultimate, I would have the ultimate responsibility for defining who is an instructor, part of, or an instructional team, and what's required for an instructor and instructional team for purposes of meeting this definition. Okay, so we've got a few thumbs down from a couple of folks, and I'd like to hear from them about why they are against that idea.
Robert, I'm going to give you a chance to speak.
Thank you. I've used so many words so far. You know, and philosophically, I'm fine with it. I think it could be a very prudent idea. There's a lot of expertise there that could be utilized. What does worry me, though, is the other discussions that have taken place around accreditors and who would be deemed an accreditor moving forward and what that might look like. So if sideways means with some pretty serious rails, I might go sideways. But as is, and with this discussion right now, I would say no until some of that's further clarified.
Go ahead, Amanda.
I concur with Robert. I think that the top reason why I voted no was just based on a couple of facts that are currently in the environment of online education, which is that it's the fastest growing growth in higher education, where we're seeing a lot of reduced quality. Students are getting hurt. There's a lot of risk-averse people who are being marketed to by these programs. So just based on, there's a lot in what you propose. There's like 3 different parts. The first part, which is accreditation, that to be just left up to accreditors, that given the current environment, to me is not doing well given the facts. And there's a report that I'll share out. Hopefully everyone gets to see it, where you can like see the studies, you can see the facts that I'm saying. It's not just hearsay. So that was the main point, which is that it shouldn't be left to accreditors to loosen or have the full authority of what those definitions are. I think the other parts we can, if they were separated and discussed separately and like not tied to first the accreditor has the authority and then you added the technical teams and why am I missing the other one? The instructor. I think those are separate, and I think all those tied together on one blanket thing, that's the main thing I was against was the accreditors.
So can I clarify?
It doesn't come with the proper protections, and I think that has to be the same conversation.
So I don't see a placard, but I'm going to ask Carol. I know, but you had done some thumbs down. I didn't know if you meant to put up your placard or not.
Oh, you're talking about.
No, yeah.
Yeah, I was thumbs down, and I share the concerns that have been articulated. I don't know that I feel like this is a very important issue, and I'm not confident that it should be something that accreditors have so much discretion over. I like the idea of creating pretty specific standards around this to protect students, and perhaps there could be some
subject matter expertise as a single faculty member, or however, whatever, single instructor or whatever.
Leah.
So as your accreditor representative, I'd just like to say a few things. I believe there are guardrails built into the recognition process for accreditors. You have to have standards on student achievement, curriculum, faculty, facilities, equipment, finance, student support, all of these things. Accreditors have to get standards around them and show that they're implemented and show they're effective. That's what the recognition process does. My suggestion was use the recognition process as the guardrails. Have the main committee that's dealing with accreditation recognition say, look, this is what we expect to see accreditors carry out as it relates to instructional team. That's all I wanted to suggest with respect to that, and just clarify that if you're looking for guardrails for accreditors, they're there. There's another committee dealing with them, and maybe there's other topics along the way that we'd want to share with the big committee about how accreditation should be engaging student protections or however we have shaping those concerns.
Hey, David Musser.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. So I appreciate those comments, and one possible option is to have the kinds of guardrails that you guys are describing be described in more detail, or at least have the accreditors require the accrediting agencies to make decisions about some guardrails that other committee determines in order to get to a place where they can define an instructor or instructional team. But I want to be really clear that for those who gave a thumbs down on that, the department cannot define what an instructor is. There's really no way for us to do that. So we need some way to have, if you want any kind of guardrail around it, it can't be the department simply setting out what that is. We are prohibited from doing that in the statute. So however we do that, we're open to that, and we're open to how we approach it and what we can put around as guardrails. But we can't, for example, we couldn't go in and say an instructor has a PhD in X or Y. The department is prohibited from making academic determinations like that. So it makes it difficult in this context for us to set guardrails, which is why I am seeking some ideas about how we can have our accrediting agency colleagues support that process.
Gregory.
Yeah, I think in looking at where we are, it seems to me that we, so most people, not everyone, say most people seem to be in favor of the idea of an instructional team. So allowing an instructional team within these guidelines. I think that it might be that if someone, opposition to a team in general, like if someone's position is going to be I simply will not countenance a team, that might put us in a position where I don't know that we could reach an agreement if there were those two things. So I'm suggesting that for those people who have a difficulty with the idea of team, it seems like those who are very much in favor of teams are willing to, they would countenance some parameters around what that team is or who that team must include. So I think maybe that's where we ought to go, and maybe kind of, at least as a group, even though I know some people have reservations with it, to accept, at least conceptually, the idea that a team is permissible and move to what would you like to see as a safeguard, given that we would be allowing the teams.
Mary?
Okay, that being said, then what would Plan C be if we can't come to an agreement that the accrediting agencies do have the knowledge and the wherewithal to say, with parameters, this is an instructional team? The department can't say it. So, Plan C.
I would say we can put parameters around what, I think we can, David, put parameters around what like we could say the team, just hypothetical, the team must include one member who meets accreditation agency standards for subject matter, the way it was in the Dear Colleague letter, sort of what David read, that language, instead of what we currently, our current guidance was just to that instructor, expanding that to the team, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, for example, as long as we're not the ones that are setting the academic requirements for the staff, things that have been proposed earlier, Jillian mentioned having, the team include a subject matter expert that, and then as Leah said, that works to push, or I think maybe it was Merity, that pushes forward the student's instruction. Something along those lines. We could say all that as long as ultimately the accreditor was the one to decide, what the academic qualifications was of the people involved, because that's where we can't be involved. Yep.
Can I ask a question related to that? I'm just not sure I understand how come the department can't define an instructor but can define an instructional team. Like, if you can say that the team has to have someone with subject matter jurisdiction, why couldn't you say that the instructor has to have subject matter jurisdiction? I don't understand the difference.
Well, we're not really saying that. We're not really saying that we're not really defining what subject matter expertise is, I guess, and we probably wouldn't use the phrase subject matter expertise either, because again, who says what that means?
I hear you, but I'm just not sure the distinction between setting standards for who an instructor could be versus setting standards for who an instructional team is.
I don't think that's what Dave is talking about. I mean, I understand your point, because there's really no difference in saying it for this or that, but I think what we're trying to get to is whether we're going to expand instructor from the statute to include the instructional teams, and then what parameters we put around the instructional team. And what David is saying is that we're prohibited from this in the statute from getting into like specific academics. It has to like the team has to include somebody that has a physics degree, but we can't get into that specific, but we can talk in general without violating the prohibition. So I don't know that he was talking about distinguishing between the instructor and instructional team. I think what we have to do is, in this context, is say that the instructional team concept doesn't violate the statutory definition or statutory term instructor.
That's helpful. I do appreciate that. I guess I was just a little confused because I thought that I understood that the department was saying that the department cannot, under the statute, define an instructor. And I understand that you're saying you can't give them academic, but it seemed odd to me that you can create parameters such as, you know, who needs to be on the team or whatever, and that would be okay. But I mean, I think it would be great for the department to put in place parameters to the extent possible. I just wasn't totally getting that. But
okay, I think I understand your concern. I'll take a look at it. But I mean, basically, I think we're just trying to implement the term instructor to be a little broader than what it is, and make sure then we're not violating our prohibition against getting into academics. And that's kind of a line that goes like this, because as lawyers, you know, I mean, you can define that line different ways depending on how you're looking at it. So I'll take a look at that. But I think the biggest issue is that the thumbs down seem to be they didn't want just a blanket, you know, leaving it completely open to the accreditors. Is that I mean, that seems to me to be the consensus of the people that voted down, is they didn't want it to be left completely to the accreditors without some kind of parameters put in.
Okay, Robert.
Yeah, I think Greg was kind of getting at this, but I think with the robust discussion that's taken place, why not kick it to the main committee, make sure they understand what the hesitancies were regarding having parameters, not being sure of what might happen or might not happen at that other theoretical level right now. And if we need to have a discussion around what some of those specifics might be, we can have that now. Because, you know, philosophically, like I said, I'm not opposed at all. It's just those other concerns and all. There's so many intricate dominoes in this process right now that are lined up, and it's just hard to know which way they're going to fall.
Jessica.
Sure. I hope that I am not understood as holding this up. That is not my intention. I've just tried to ask this question, and those of you who do this like curricular work, maybe you could give me an answer. What is the regular and substantive instruction vision for non-instructor led interactions? Like what, I think there really is an answer out there that's important to someone, and I just can't quite understand what, and I'm not talking about the circumstance in which we have a pair of people working together, both of whom seems like they could independently be qualified as the instructor, and each of them is alternating. I think that would pretty clearly be okay under an instructor. So is there something else that member of an instructional team gets us, where there's someone who's not an instructor who's doing instructing? I literally just don't understand.
I mean, I can give an example of how we do it at Capella for our direct assessment team or direct assessment program, which is we have a tutor, somebody who's a tutor, and then somebody who's the faculty on record who work together in courses. And so the tutor is a subject matter expert also, though they're not faculty qualified according to our accreditor, but they're responsive to questions from students. They're reaching out, they're engaging in study sessions and available for tutoring sessions. And then that faculty member is the one that's providing summative feedback to the assessments that are being submitted by the student. And so it's taking some of the sort of lower value work. I'm not saying that right. I don't mean it to be pejorative, but and moving it to that tutor, and then the faculty is able to focus on the highest value work that they can provide to the student. Is that helpful? I don't know if that was your question.
So is your concern that under that circumstance, the faculty member and student interaction would not be it is substantive, but it wouldn't be regular enough to otherwise meet the definition of regular and substantive if that's just a floor?
No, I think the concern would be if your accreditor doesn't view that tutor as an instructor, then that doesn't count towards regular and substantive interaction.
Because I think
Denise.
we're dealing with an old statute, right? And I think the concept of instructor and what an instructor means versus, I think, how do you say her name? Merity had said about using the term faculty, because faculty could be people other than instructors. I think this uses an antiquated term, instructor. So I guess one of the questions might help that David, if you guys could talk about what other people are on the teams that you envision. Would that be helpful? I think that might be helpful.
Well, and I think it might help a little bit with Carolyn to give an example, and I might mix up my accreditors here, so I apologize. But it's Middle States or SACS, I think, has a standard that a quote-unquote subject matter expertise would be somebody with 18 graduate hours in the field who's teaching an undergraduate course. I think Higher Learning Commission they have the next degree higher to be teaching that course. So that's an example of and I'm using regional accreditors because I don't know what your measures are, but those are kind of examples of what we live with and what defines that level of expertise. I think I've heard consistency and agreement that the idea that a team needs to have somebody who meets their accreditation standards for that, however that's defined, realizing it's defined differently based on our accreditors. As far as the teams go, I've seen it happen in several ways, and I've seen it in some emerging fields, and we're going to continue to see this. When we first put out Homeland Security, we had no subject matter experts in Homeland Security. So you pulled together teams of experts in designing those courses. If you go way back in the day, that happened in computer science. We relied on mathematicians, and we're going to continue to see that happen. So it's not just who's doing kind of the summative feedback, which I liked. Actually, I thought maybe that could be a good term to use in the substantive part of it. Who's assigning the grade? Sometimes it's somebody on that team. Sometimes a piece of it and a lot of faculty interactions that happen in traditional education is around career planning. And I don't mean look at your resume. I mean, if I want to go on to a doctoral program in psychology, there's some of that stuff that would be included on that team for a student to say, well, then we need to look at X, Y, and Z, particularly as you get into some of the graduate or research components. So those teams can be really mixed. I think what we were trying to clarify, and I think Jillian and I were on the same page, is saying one of the things we're also realizing is these students need other supports. They need time management. We are worried about the drop-off rate in these students. So they need time management. They need coaching in other ways. Those are critical parts of the team. They do not count toward the regular and substantive academic intervention. So I think we're all actually closer on the same page than the dialogues leading into.
Okay, so what you're saying is that the accreditors right now have different standards on what they consider a subject matter expert? No, they're not? Okay.
It's fairly consistent. It's 18 credit hours in that subject area in addition to your graduate degree or your doctoral degree, depending on the level of degree, associate, bachelor's, master's, at stair steps. And it's fairly consistent across institutional accreditors.
Okay. All right. So I guess from the consumer perspective, what would you want to see? Jessica?
I feel like I just don't understand what's happening, and I'm sorry, I promise I'm reading the Code of Federal Regulations. So I understand that the federal law says distance education must be regular and substantive. The Code of Federal Regulations are saying distance education must be regular and substantive and have these things. And you've told me this is a floor and accreditors can go above it. And I thought what I heard you saying as well, my program does have regular and substantive instruction between a faculty and the students, but there's also these other people who are also giving regular and substantive instruction, but since they're not faculty or don't have the credentialing required by the accreditor, then that somehow messes with your ability to do this from some accreditor imposed requirements. I feel like there's a piece missing maybe.
I think we're saying we want clarity that, and remember, we're trying to look across a broad spectrum of people who might be doing this. So I think what we're saying is we want clarity that that is not on the team, or that does not count. They can be on the team. That does not count toward the instruction, the regular and substantive instructional interaction that's happening.
I actually think you're in the same
I think we're in the exact same
And I
place.
think Jillian's in the same place.
And David?
I was just going to suggest that if you're looking for some kind of guardrails, I think the best we're going to be able to do, given your parameters, is to say something very general like an instructional team must deliver at least the same quality of instruction as an individual instructor.
Meet the same standards.
Well, not every member of the team. But I don't know what else. I mean, I'm not sure that, without being more prescriptive than you want to be.
Can I ask a question, Leah? I'm sorry. So would a TA meet that standard? No, right? I didn't. They might, but they might not.
Yeah, so a doctoral student would meet that standard.
Okay. All right.
Right?
I'm just trying to see where we can get everybody on the same
Yeah, see, I
page
mean,
so that we have the ability to have more than one
But a
person.
TA in a team with another faculty member might.
Yeah, so I mean,
Right.
I think the maybe a better way to come at this is to ask what problem are we trying to solve and why are we worried about this? So, especially in self-paced programs, what often happens is that students have needs that the faculty member, for lack of a better term, is not equipped to solve, right? So the student needs sort of life coaching, or the student needs advising about bureaucratic issues, or time management support, or really base level tutoring in a particular area, or you have a lot of students and you need a grader. Those are all interactions that won't count currently under regular and substantive. And so what happens is that the system becomes very inefficient for institutions that are trying to teach self-paced, competency-based programs because the faculty member ends up having to do a lot of this stuff, or you have to do a lot of back-end work to fix it. And so what we're saying is that the team actually can be not only more efficient, but provide better service to the student with no degradation of quality of instruction and still meet the requirements.
Gregory?
I think, well, if you go back and look at that statutory definition of substantive, and, I certainly wasn't there when they came up with it, or Congress did it, but you can imagine the people, the aides, if we want to say it probably wasn't the actual congressman, sitting around with a very traditional, having had an extremely traditional education, and trying to make this fit. And you can see then, you would say, within those parameters, interaction with an instructor, or whatever that meant to them. I think what we're trying to do is to accommodate, to accept and acknowledge that education has broadened and changed. Some of the, I know I've seen, I saw a presentation from Capella. A couple of other institutions came and did them for us, demonstrating their learning management systems, which are amazingly sophisticated, quite beyond anything that I really ever envisioned myself. And so a lot of times, I think there are people on these teams who help the students interact with these very sophisticated systems, which can be difficult to learn how to do. And that's a very necessary, as I think you pointed out, David, a very necessary part. I think where we are, though, is that a lot of people feel, yeah, that's all well and good, and nothing wrong with those people, but there still needs to be, we still want to make certain that regardless of how much support there is for all that, that there is a subject matter, for lack of a better word, even though David probably doesn't like my using the term, a subject matter expert or someone there. We can't define what that is. Maybe we could use that word, but that's going to be an accreditor, saying that person has to have this many hours at whatever. So I think trying to acknowledge, can we get to a place where we have the safeguard that there will be subject matter expertise there, but accommodate the idea that we're not just going to key it to that a really narrow definition of this instructor. Greg Martin's the instructor, and he will be the one to have the everyday contact all the time with 4,000 people. I think that's that's maybe we're looking at that as maybe being an antiquated model and trying to move beyond that, but still keep those protections in place. And what I'm hearing around the table is I don't think anybody from anybody here has said, no, we want carte blanche. I don't want any parameters put around it at all. So I think that's a good thing. It's just what those are going to be.
And I agree. And I wanted to see if I could provide at least maybe a little bit more explanation and background for situations that have been brought to the department's attention that sparked the department's concern and kind of led to this. And maybe a helpful way to do it would be to provide an example. So let's say that I'm a student in a competency-based program, and I'm in two courses. The first course is English. I'm an English major. I'm assuming that's easy for everybody, which is not. But let's say that they're very good at English. They go through, do all the required readings. Mostly they're interacting with the online, the software, the books provided, everything that they need, and they're communicating regularly with a member of the instructional team whose job it is to contact them and make sure that they have everything that they need in order to succeed. So the student in the English class, he doesn't really need much of anything. They flow through the class. They get to the final project. They do the final paper. Someone grades it and says, "You've done very well. You didn't really need this." And their team member is happy and it goes along. The same student is also in calculus, and I was terrible at math, so I'm going to assume everyone is. So in calculus, they're really struggling. They check in with that instructional team member. That person says, you didn't do well on your pretest, and it looks like you're not grasping some of these basic concepts. So number one, we want you to look at this part of our instructional software, and then number two, I'm sending you to our instructor of record for this course because I want you to work personally with them. And that student works with that instructor practically every other day that week and works with them very consistently until he gets those concepts and he's able to finish the test. So what schools have told us are that in that situation, they're being forced to have their English instructor contact the student every week and say, "Are you doing okay still? We'd like to have a discussion." And the English student says, "I'm fine. I don't need that. I don't need any part of that. It's great." And it's a sort of bureaucratic requirement that they don't feel that is necessary. So what the department's intent here is to find ways of taking this and other kinds of innovative kinds of programs that are utilizing people's time and effort well, without creating bureaucratic impediments that just aren't helpful. So that's trying to give a better sense of what we're trying to achieve here.
So Jessica.
To me, that English class sounds a lot like a correspondence course.
So let's assume that the student's friend, number two, had trouble with English. That student would have gotten interaction with the English instructor every couple of days, whereas they wouldn't have needed any help in the calculus class because they were excellent. So if I understand if that's how you consider the class, then that may be your view on it. But I want to make sure that I explain that that's the situation that the department is kind of trying to address. That there doesn't seem to be a need to require a specific kind of person to interact with the student in every specific case, but we have the requirement in law, and we want to be sure that we are adequately addressing that requirement to separate these from correspondence courses.
Gregory.
Yeah, to your comment, Jessica, I come from and I'll be honest, I come from a background wedded to traditional, I loved being in the classroom and having my professor read Chaucer to me because I too, like David, was pretty poor at math and relished my Renaissance and medieval English classes because they did quite well in those. And they clearly prepared me excellently for what I do now, right? But I think that, as opposed, like in saying what's correspondence, but I have to be honest. I had a friend in college who went to matrix algebra the first day, the midterm, and the last day. He got an A in the class. If we're looking at this, if I'm being honest, and I'm trying to be, I'm not saying you're wrong, and I'm not saying you don't have a good point, but I'm just talking about my own thought process and how I've thought about all this. I thought if I think to myself, quite frankly, what substantive interaction did he have? he didn't have any. He just showed up one day, another day, and the last day. And the professor didn't have any. He didn't have any attendance. So I mean that, and he got an A. So you could say, well, legitimately he met the qualifications of the course. But I think. I'm not saying that means anything other than that. I just throw it out there because I think these situations are possible in any setting, and I think I don't know who it was it maybe David or Russell that pointed out that just because it's bricks and mortar doesn't automatically mean that we have this higher level of interaction or learning taking place. I just want to point that out.
Okay. So. This is just an observation by me. I mean, we've been dealing with this subject for a long time.
Yeah.
And I can tell you right now, you're not going to come out to a fine point.
Yeah.
All right. So there's obviously going to be a lot of permutations on this. Mm-hmm. And our job is really, if I'm not mistaken, is to offer it to a larger group that's really going to make a decision. So.
Yeah, and just to go back to what we discussed earlier, at the end of our discussions, we can say that what the department has is perfect, which probably we may not say. We can say that what the department has is good with these changes that we propose. We can say that some people think that it's good and want these things, and other people want these things. So we want to make sure that all the views are addressed at the end of this process, and we don't need to have all of that finished, remember, until after the second session of our subcommittee meeting, before the next full committee meeting. We want to get as much talked about as we can during these 2 days, but you have some time to think about this, ponder it, come back and give us some more information then. But I don't want to spend too much more time on this. I think Tony's right that we won't get too much further at this point.
One of the things I've heard a little bit is kind of what's the problem and can you help frame this? And that made me think of this a little bit. And knowing that my name's on a letter or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 to the department saying clarify this, the beauty of some of the things we're discussing is that being able to personalize the educational journey. So take you out of the 100-seat or even 25-seat. I went to a very small private institution classroom where we all did the same thing every day and progressed at the same rate. Some of the beauties that we're getting in this, in some of the technology we're discovering, is that we can individualize that experience, and we can take the person who's an English buff or a history buff, and we can try and make their assignments more interactive with where they are. And we can take somebody like me, who we have to go right back again to say, okay, when did we write the Constitution and what's in it? And so I want to make sure we don't lose that we're really trying to find a way here to enable that. But to give institutions a way to do it, the threat of aid is a huge risk to an institution in their future, and in that case to their students. So I think we're trying to say what does, and when I said the floor earlier, I don't mean that as a bad thing. I think we need to say what are those safety nets we have to have in place. And I feel when I've been pushing out to the department, that's why I've done it for my current institution and from previous institutions, saying, let's make sure we understand what that is, because I don't want my students having less of an education than they should. I want to make sure it's respected the way it should be. But I also want to know where we are open in growing those areas and moving education beyond the boundaries that we've known in traditional ed. So I don't know if that helps frame it better, but that's why I'm here.
Sue?
It hasn't been stated, and I think it's important because we all live it every day. And when you talk about student protection, we have a growing number of accommodations that we are making. And when I think about this instructional team, I think about the entire team for a guaranteed success of that student. So I think we need to make sure that we are thinking of things like testing accommodations that we are all doing and some of the other things. So that is as much part of the need for this team as anything.
Jillian.
Yeah, I would just add, I think I said this at the beginning, I'm sorry for the times I say things more than once, but I would just encourage if you could come back with us with an answer about if there is a possible way to define competency-based education, because I think it would help find, potentially, if it's done right, could help find a middle ground between allowing for some of these innovative models to happen without risking the entirety of distance education and opening up to potential fraud.
It's one of the tasks I'm going to take back right away, because I do agree, because I do think that is really the difficulty here, is we got the competency-based versus the traditional, and a lot of the institutions that Jessica's students have been to, where they're basically ripping off the government and the student. That's what they're doing. So we got to have the protections in, but I think part of it is trying to define the two things. So I'm going to take that back and see if there is a hook in the statute where we can differentiate between competency-based and I want to call them a regular institution, but I don't have another term.
Yep, thanks.
Just to clarify, are you saying that we should define it for the purpose of treating them a little differently, for example?
I'm saying in the spirit of trying to find a solution that I think accounts for what we've heard here in terms of all the examples that I've heard, I think, and maybe I'm not incorporating all of them, but a lot of them at least have talked about competency-based education programs. That also is a model that I feel like has a bit more history than whatever model we can't envision yet that could somehow slide into a loophole that we're creating here and allow for taxpayer funds to be threatened. So maybe it's not the solution, but I think it would be interesting for this group to know if that's a potential solution.
Yeah, we
then
can take it back.
We can have sort of a subset conversation, if it is, about what that means in terms of how accreditors have to understand CBE programs. I mean, it just creates more work for everybody, right? But I think it's an option to pursue.
Okay. Jody. Go ahead, Jody.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of take a quick step back, and I think a lot of what, especially Jessica's concerns, are really about the bad actors, right, and the worst case scenarios. And I absolutely agree that that should be at the forefront of the conversation, but I would caution against going in a direction that's overly prescriptive, that would, that is tailoring everything to the bad actors and unnecessarily constraining the good ones. So I just thought that, we should maybe think about that. And also, I just want to kind of, maybe I'm such a fan of the program integrity triad, and take a step back. And this is an area where, because there's flexibility that's required, this isn't really the best role for the department to fulfill, and that's why accreditors are in a better position, because they are on the ground and able and have the resources to evaluate these programs on the ground. So that's why I think this is definitely, in addition to the statutory requirements, this is definitely more appropriate for accreditors. But I share your concerns.
Sue. Oh, okay. In case, I think it's Russell and then David.
Thank you. And Jillian, thanks for asking that question about the CBE. And I'm glad, Denise, that you're going to look at that, because it seems that if we're really looking at innovations and looking out even farther in the future than the next 4 to 5 years, that really this conversion from a credit Carnegie model to a competency-based model is really going to help solve a lot of things, because if we can start measuring what actually works and where do we get student outcomes versus worrying about how we did it and how much interaction and what did we do here, that it seems like that is going to be the ultimate answer to a lot of the things around the consumer protection. So anything that we can do in terms of putting that into a competency-based education definition as a start, and if we can start looking at moving the credit hour over so that people have to start thinking more about competencies in any of these things, that would be very helpful also.
David?
Just a question for you, Jillian. You didn't bring up the CBE thing because you think that the team stuff ought to apply only there, did you?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know.
So I'd like it not to apply only there.
I'm guessing that's probably true.
Okay.
I think we'll go ahead.
I just want to point out that we've got about 25 minutes left in the session, and so we may want to have about 5 minutes for housekeeping before we wrap this up.
Yeah. I'm looking to Greg, since I'm the assistant to the meeting organizer. Do you want? That's right. That's right. Doesn't work without both of us. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Why don't we? Because it kind of keys into what David's already talking about, he's going to continue with state authorization. Before he does it, I want to reiterate, I think it's very important to say that when we report out to the main team, I'm adamant that everybody's views be expressed. So even if the majority of the team feels one way, if there's even one person who feels another, I want that will definitely be made clear. Nobody's voice will be silenced. I was also asked by Lynn Mahaffey to point out, and I failed to do it, that we will be producing a new set of red lines for you that will have comment boxes to explain our rationale behind the changes. So rather than just a paper that tells what we're doing, we'll actually give you the rationale behind the changes. I think that will help a lot as we go forward, especially into 668. So we can look forward to that coming the next time we're here. So with that, turn it over to David.
So moving in, I think this is not going to be quite as big a discussion because we're kind of asking you guys to go off and think about this and come back. But I want to talk now about state authorization for distance education. So in general, as you guys may or may not know, the department regulated on this topic back in 2016. That regulation was to become effective as of July 1st, 2018. The department delayed the enforcement of that regulation. And here we are proposing to remove the regulatory language that was put in place in that prior rulemaking. But we are interested we have heard from folks that there may be some value in having language or rules related to reciprocity agreements among states, and that could be helpful. So we're interested in discussing how you guys think that could be helpful, what things that you think are important about that, and what we should look at. So I see some cards up already, and I'm just going to be quiet and let you guys talk first.
Go ahead, Carol.
Thanks very much. I have lots of opinions about this one. As a state attorney general office representative, it's something that's been under a lot of discussion with the state attorneys general, and also I participated in the rulemaking in 2014 that resulted in this the state authorization language that is now being considered to be deleted. So I guess my perspective and our office's perspective, my constituency's perspective, is that it would be very bad for consumers and bad for taxpayers and bad for states if this provision were eliminated. And I can talk a little bit about why that is. The state attorneys general, specifically in our focus on consumer protection, have been, unfortunately, very much focused on having to address misconduct by some bad actors in specifically some certain sectors, for-profit sector, and many of whom provide distance education as part of their mission. And we have seen, unfortunately, that there is apparently a lot of this quite widespread fraud, the same kind of thing that Jessica has been talking about, but I see it from maybe a slightly different perspective because it's not necessarily that I'm talking, to consumers about their how this has affected their lives as much as I'm sort of seeing it sort of from the perspective of, wow, this is such a widespread issue that we are seeing that there are so many different states that have had to devote so much time to it. Sorry if I'm going on a little bit. I'll try to be a little bit more succinct. But anyway, the reason the provision is helpful is that it helps states, the specific state authorization language that has been eliminated, it helps states identify who from outside of our state is operating within our state, helps us ensure that we are going to be getting complaint so that we're going to be able to identify the bad actors and understand what's going on. So the complaint thing is really important. And the language related to state reciprocity agreements, which is also going to be discussed by our committee, but is not entirely, it's could be discussed separately, as David has suggested, is very helpful to us in that the way the language is now, or was coming out of the previous rulemaking, ensures that state reciprocity agreements are going to not impede state offices from enforcing all of our state laws when our students are affected in our state. So if that language is eliminated, we're in a situation where there's sort of two levels of enforcement that states are able to accomplish. One is we can enforce all of our state laws to protect consumers when there's a school that's physically located in our state. But based on the way the reciprocity agreements are affecting our state, we are not able to protect all of our consumers, the ones who are in distance education programs that are being offered in our state from outside of our state, to the extent that there are specific laws that, for example, might provide specific disclosure requirements, refunds that are related specifically to educational institutions. So that's just a little overview, and we feel very strongly about this, and be happy to offer further thoughts at some other point.
Okay, I think it was kind of a draw, so I'm going to call Russell.
Great, thank you. I've seen a few things. There's this that talked about that eliminating this rule would save institutions all sorts of money and all sorts of time to do this. And this goes back to the Senate overview of regulations and trying to streamline regulations that came out of a few years ago. But actually, that really isn't true, because even without the federal requirement on this, the states still expect institutions to comply. And so, we would really like to see the state authorization as a requirement for receiving aid as something to be retained, because it seems like institutions should be following state laws as a precursor to dispersing federal aid. There's some things that need to be fixed in terms of in the other language where they were using residence instead of location, and that was a problem that we thought we had fixed back in the 2014 thing, and it somehow reemerged out of all this. And then there's also language about notifications on professional licensure, that it seems like that is something where if an institution is enrolling students in a state in, let's say, a nursing program, something like that, that they should be able to inform the student whether that institution meets the academic requirements for licensure in that state. And so those are some things that we have there on that. We'd also like to see acknowledgement that reciprocity is a means to the proof of approval within a state, that has it. Probably I'll be on the opposite side of Carolyn in terms of the trying how to interpret the language that is here in front of us. First of all, that if you're going to get rid of all the state authorization language, I don't know why you would then, and you're not going to tie it to federal financial aid, what is your role in terms of looking at a reciprocity agreement? That doesn't make any sense to me. But if you do keep it and then have something on reciprocity, that doing something like as the language as it is written here, but we can come back to some things that it turns out the department didn't really mean what they wrote here. We were able to get a letter from the former Secretary of Education that says that they actually meant that it's not that the agreement prohibits the state, but the state has agreed to use the standards of the reciprocity agreement. So it's not really prohibiting any of these things. And if you were to do something where you allowed every state to do whatever different laws that they had in the state, different requirements they had every state, you then are at a situation where you no longer have reciprocity. So if you have refund policies in one state and another refund policy in another state, and you have certain institutions have to operate differently in yet another state, It's really not reciprocity anymore that it's killed that. And so those are a lot of deep issues. It's the end of the day. I'll stop.
I have 4 plackets up in 15 minutes, so it's like a quiz show. So, Jody, you're up.
I can just make a quick background statement, which, and I think this kind of goes to the comment I was making earlier about being careful about regulating broadly when you're trying to capture bad actors. This is something that has been a huge problem for our institutions, the private nonprofit sector. These disclosure requirements have been extremely burdensome, and I'm not sure that they've necessarily served their intended purpose in terms of capturing bad actors. So that's kind of the stance that I come at this discussion with, and we can talk more tomorrow.
Thank you. Meredith?
I'll be quick following on Jody a little bit. I think they probably met some of them in some of the ways, like licensing and things I think are so pure. You need that, to me, is a no-brainer, that students ought to be able to quickly figure out if the program they're taking will leave them licensed in their state or in any state they desire to end up in. But I want to echo Jody's comments that having been in several institutions with locations or students in all 50 states and several territories, these requirements are disparate, they're onerous. So many of them are not at all related. I've sent fire marshals everywhere. I have flown around and sent people all over the place. So I want to leave it with, this is one I think we need to thread the needle on, because I think there's some value add here. And I think clarity of if students have issues and complaints and how to capture that, I just don't think the broad swath that we did met it before.
Thank you. Jillian.
Just in the interest of time, I'll keep my comments brief as well, which largely echo what Russ said. I think the perspective I represent, especially on behalf of our two institutions, is that students in distance ed programs that reside in any state should be protected. So we believe that there was value in the Obama era state authorization rule. I think there were some issues with it. To get to Russ's point about definition and reciprocity agreements, and also, some nits around what happens if a state doesn't have a complaint process in place. But largely, we need to make sure that we have an eye towards protecting students who are apart from where their institution is located. With respect to the licensure requirement, Capella University offers several programs that lead to professional licensure, and we think that it's in the best interest of students to make sure students who are enrolling in those programs understand if they're actually going to be able to get a job where they live. So while I get that it's sort of an onerous process, I think it's important with respect to protecting students' investment in their education. And would say with the addition of SARA or sort of any reciprocity system that's up and running, I think the overwhelming cost that used to exist in making sure you were licensed to operate in every state it's not really a factor anymore, because SARA provides a pathway to making sure that you're able to operate your distance ed programs across multiple states.
Carolyn. Never mind. Okay. Leah.
I'd like to have a conversation at some point on this topic about how we can preserve the benefits of reciprocity. But if there are concerns about a bad actor that needs investigated by law enforcement, by all means, let's get right on that. Let's involve the accreditor. Let's involve that state. Let's involve whoever needs to be participating in that. I don't think anybody ever intended reciprocity to prevent going after an actor that's not taking care of students the way they should be. And if we see complaints coming that are systematic, that should engage a whole lot of people in the process.
Robert.
I'll keep this really brief. Something Leah just said, hit on this as representing state higher ed systems. You mentioned the different components of the triad when it comes to addressing some of the bad actors, and that's really something that's undergirding all of this, and that we frankly all need to do a better job of reestablishing that relationship and making sure that we have good communications between the feds who protect the taxpayers, us within the state systems. We have a lot of oversight of our students and some consumer protection responsibilities there, and the accreditors dealing directly with institutions. And we all have our sets of data, and we all know that there can sometimes be difficulties in different areas, but we don't, I think, talk to each other enough on some of these. And so figuring out paths of communication and ways of sharing information when appropriate, putting systems into place and regular communication so that we can better address some of these instances before it blows up in the form of a very bad actor that we're all left trying to sweep up the pieces and figuring out what went wrong. So,
Gregory?
I think we'll call it a day as far as our discussions go. Housekeeping things, I'll try to see if I get them all. Scott can correct me if I'm wrong. Please make certain that you leave your name, your
Badges
here. And I think, can we keep our materials here, Scott? Amy's here. Well, I guess we can keep everything here. I would not recommend anything valuable, but not that these materials are not extremely valuable, but you may leave them here. Diane's in the back of the room there. I have to say that. Just kidding. So yeah, feel free to leave all that here. Again, as Scott pointed out, monitor the
OPM website.
OPM website for possible delays tomorrow. Just to reiterate it, if whatever the delay is, that's when we'll start. If, for example, it were a 2-hour delay, we would begin promptly at 11. Given no delays, we will be back here again tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.
Okay. Go ahead.
No, just an aside. For those of you that are not from here, just be warned that people in D.C. do not know how to drive in the snow.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Just saying.
If you have any trash, please do dispose of that on your way out. There's trash cans right outside this room.
I thought we had an excellent discussion today. I thank all of you for your participation. I really was impressed with what was said and how far we got, so we look forward to an equally productive discussion tomorrow.
And on a small note, I just want to say from this angle, David Musser, you remind me of a young Jeff Baker.
I'll tell Jeff you said so, and we'll see if he's insulted or not.